Hey
Hey,
ho!
hey ho.
Calling Chris Anderson in Tokyo.
This is Chris Anderson, Tokyo. You can see it. That's Tokyo.
I recognize the skyline out your window.
Uh, yeah, that's about if I turn around in my room, I'll bump into the skyline. So it's this
Oh,
tiny
that's
little room. So calling
got it.
require in Chicago.
Chicago! Chicago, still here for
Chicago.
a
Yeah.
couple of weeks before I join you in Normandy. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. Speaking of which, Chris, how's the grand tour going?
The Grand Tour is going well. We finished up Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Osaka, Kyoto, and now we're finishing at Tokyo. And then 3 days in Tokyo, and then it's off to Toronto. Short stop in Boston. Get some fried clams and clam chowder, and then back home to London
Go see a Red Sox game.
3 whole days.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I might just.
And are you with a group, or are you it's just you and Anna and the future of Ambrose touring in Eastern Asia?
The future of Ambrose tours in the Pacific are in my very hands, right?
Oh, awesome.
Just doing site inspection work. So,
that's almost the most fun of all, right? After you're done with the site inspection, the rest is just going back again.
It's just work.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, it's just work. Don't tell the people who come on the tours. Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us today. We're going to present an encore episode about Admiral Nimitz with our friend Craig Symonds. Let us know you're here. Let us know what you're drinking. It's 10 a.m. in the morning where Chris is as we record this, so I suspect he's already hitting the scotch, but I don't know for sure, or the Suntory whiskey.
Well, I have finally decided that I am going to take the bold step and try Japanese single malt, which I swore
fantastic,
I'd never do. But I'm inspired. So.
It's late at night here, so I'm done drinking already. And I think it all pretty much shows. We want to thank everybody, Chris, who supports us via Patreon, because those are great people, and this is our Patreon top shelf patrons. And hey, there's room for at least 6 more people before we have to start turning away top shelf patrons. So,
or just get a smaller font.
Or get a smaller font, or page 2. So all good. Ooh. You can join the Pirate Crew, be a top shelf patron or a patron at any level, and we appreciate everybody at patreon.com/historyhappyhour. So what do you think? Are we ready to start this encore episode?
Well, do we have all the accoutrements? Because the last time we didn't have all the accoutrements.
We are. There has been a turnover in the production team since then. Okay. Heads have rolled. New systems have been put into place. I think we're in good shape.
Yeah, because I brought my 2 fingers.
Oh, excellent. Well done. Did you bring cases for them?
Yes. All right. Bar is open.
The bar is open, and it is our pleasure today to bring back naval historian Craig Symonds for his 3rd appearance on History Happy Hour. And Craig taught at the U.S. Naval Academy and the Naval War College. He's here to talk about his new book, Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. And our friend Joe Balkowski, who trumps you, Craig, he's a 4-time guest, says, and I quote, Craig is a great guy and one of the most talented historians in the U.S. What an introduction. Craig Symonds, thank you for joining us. Oh, my gosh,
Joe, thank you so much. I'm so honored, especially coming from you. That's a great tribute. Thank you.
Oh. Did you bring a cocktail today, Mr. Symonds?
I have a glass of wine. Does that count?
It does?
It does.
It does. How about you, Mr. Anderson?
Guinness.
Okay. Well, Craig, I got to tell you, I was inspired by your book, by page 149, and I have made myself a Nimitz signature cocktail.
That's what I should have had tonight.
A sink pack special with bourbon, rum, bitters, and sugar.
Yep.
And
have you tasted one of these? As strictly for research purposes, since that was the cocktail that he made for everybody.
I have tried it several times with similar results each time, and I marvel at the fact that Admiral Nimitz not only often had one of these before dinner, he occasionally had two.
It is hard to imagine even having it tastes great, but even one might prove to be a problem as we get towards the end of the show. And Craig, just because here in History Happy Hour, we can't take, there's no amount of time is too much time to talk about the drinks. I actually found, in addition to your recipe, I found in the National Archives another version of this recipe for making this by the gallon. And it started, and so apparently Nimitz was really important to have a good supply, and I love this because the first thing in the recipe, it says start with a clean 1 gallon jug, right? So you need that. But the interesting thing, Craig, and now we're going to see how far you've really plumbed this area, is
Right.
I found that in the Best Truman papers. What is Best Truman doing with Nimitz's signature cocktail recipe? What's going on there?
That is appalling. I will never recover from that piece of information. Oh my God.
Yeah,
Maybe she was using it as a dire warning.
I want to know. This might be volume 2 of the Nimitz story. What's going on there? Chris, I pretty much used up all my questions for the show. So,
it's gonna sound mundane after that introduction, but so Craig, kind of right from the get go, this is an awful lot about personality and command style, and that's kind of the focus of the book. So, one of the things you say at the beginning that really struck me is said that Nimitz, and you also mentioned Eisenhower and Marshall, offered a different sort of leadership style. So what was that style, and why do you think that stuck out?
That's a great opening question. I made an opening division between those who are the kind of leaders who draw their sword and charge ahead against all obstacles and devil take the hindmost. And we think of Bull Halsey, we think of George Patton, and there are others. You could probably make a fairly long list of these people. And as I said in the book, you need these people in war. You want them on your side, but you don't necessarily want them crafting global strategy. For that, it takes a more nuanced, a more thoughtful, and quite frankly, a more patient approach to the problems of war making. And for that, I think people like George Marshall and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Leahy, Eisenhower, and of course, in this particular case, Chester Nimitz, who I think is an exemplar. And they're probably drinking sink packs there, but I don't know what Craig is coming out of the top. You want people like that making the large decisions, and you want them there because they can bring together the various elements of war making, from logistics to strategy to planning to execution and operational accomplishment from the higher levels. And if you don't have that, you can be as ferocious as you want to be, and you probably aren't going to get done what you need to get done. So I think Nimitz falls into that same category with Leahy and George Marshall.
So it's interesting that FDR appoints Nimitz to command in the Pacific Pacific Fleet shortly after Pearl Harbor, and he'd actually thought about appointing him a year earlier. Nimitz is not that senior. There's definitely more senior people than him. How does FDR kind of see this? Like, how does he know that Nimitz is the kind of person he wants in that role?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, he had worked with Nimitz very closely. Nimitz was head of what was then called the Bureau of Navigation. Today we call it the Bureau of Personnel. That is to say, he determined what officers would serve where and what jobs they would have. He looked at every portfolio of every officer in the Navy to decide who should go where. And it's a powerful position, but it's one with problems as well, because not everybody likes the job that they get assigned. But because he had that job, he was in Washington, D.C. He worked with the president closely enough that the president would call his house and ask for Chester. So Nimitz was a known quantity to FDR. And what prompted FDR to seek his appointment a year before Pearl Harbor was that he had grown disenchanted, isn't a strong enough word, with Nimitz's predecessor, who had flown to Washington to complain to the president, among other things, that the people in the fleet did not have sufficient confidence in the commander-in-chief as head of the government. Well, that's a shocking thing to say at any time, and particularly to this president who conceives of himself as a Navy man. So FDR was eager to get rid of James Richardson as chief of naval operations, or commander of the Pacific Fleet at this time, and looking for a replacement. Nimitz was a known quantity. He felt he was somebody he could rely upon. He'd had the job for a good length of time, and FDR felt it was a safe appointment. But when he broached it to Admiral Nimitz, Nimitz said, essentially, no, sir. No, thank you, sir. Nimitz believed, and I think rightly so, that the antipathy of those 52 admirals who were senior to him would have been so great that it would have been hard for them to accept him as Pacific Fleet commander, that it was too soon to make that move. And so FDR backed away. And of course, the long-term ramifications of this are enormous, because instead FDR appoints husband Kimmel, who is the officer in command at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attack on 7 December, and is therefore shelved for the rest of the war. Had Nimitz been there, it's possible to argue, oh, well, he would have been more proactive in preventing that attack, possibly, but he might well have been victimized by it, just as Kimmel was, and shelved, and that would have been a tremendous loss to the American side in this conflict.
So, Craig, one of the things, I mean, one of those fly-on-the-wall moments that I've always thought would have been amazing to be witness to is when Nimitz comes to take command. He arrives in Pearl Harbor. The remains of the Pacific Fleet are still smoking, wreckage everywhere, and people, I mean, would have naturally assumed that he would have come down there with a very sharp sword and started chopping a lot away, but he doesn't do that. And I would like you to maybe kind of describe that to our viewers, and then maybe where you think that reaction came from.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if he didn't come with a sword, there was a great expectation he would at least come with a broom to sweep out the old, get rid of these people who had failed on the day of infamy, had not lived up to the expectations of the government and the people who put them there, and so on. Certainly everybody who had been on Admiral Kimmel's staff expected that their future fate would be essentially the same as that of Admiral Kimmel. They'd be fired from their jobs and sent, at best, to some paper-pushing position back stateside. It's curious that when Nimitz went to Pearl Harbor, and it was, as you say, immediately after the day of infamy, so he had very little time to assemble information, much less a staff, so he arrived literally by himself. So he didn't have a staff. He didn't even have an aide with him at the time. He walked in alone to this room full of staff members of Admiral Kimmel, many of whom were still loyal to Admiral Kimmel, many of whom didn't know who this new guy was or what was going to happen. And Nimitz's treatment of them absolutely astonished them. He walked up and he said, look, we've suffered a terrible reverse. I'm going to need you. I'm going to need your help to turn this around so we can win this war. He looked them in the eye. He shook their hand. He thanked them for their dedication. He asked for their help. And oh my gosh, what an impact that had. And he kept most of those staff members in their places. Now, over time, he found that one or two of them were not working out, or he had new people that he wanted to put in place. So there was some change over time, but he did not come in with a broom. He did not sweep out the old and begin a new regiment. Instead, he brought them around to his side. And it was Admiral Spruance, who was in the room, later said it was like somebody opened a window.
Wow. You know, one of our guests mentions, of course, the fact that Nimitz was a submariner. I mean, he came up in submarines. So he's taking over the Navy at an interesting point. It's been kind of a battleship Navy. the battleships are smoking now, literally at Pearl Harbor. They're going to be the ones that are survived are going to be sent back to the west coast until they can figure out how to use them. It's going to be a carrier navy. He's neither a battleship guy, particularly, although he has served in surface ships, or a carrier guy, but he's going to have to figure out what the strategy is for this new war in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's mostly true. I will suggest that I think there's been a sensitivity that's a little bit misplaced, that somehow everybody thought the battleships were still the most important vessel until December 7th. And then all of a sudden we thought, oh my gosh, no, look, it's the aircraft carrier. That was a more nuanced and long-term change. People understood, Navy people understood well before December 7, 1941, that the aircraft carrier, with its much longer reach, was going to be the dominant war vessel of the next conflict. That was not a stunning surprise. It is true that it was hard after that to figure out, what are we going to do now with these castles of steel, as Winston Churchill called them, now that it's clear carriers are the dominant vessel. Battleships are too slow to keep up with the carriers. Carriers go at 33 knots. Battleships top out at about 21, 22 knots. If you slow the carrier down to stay with the battleship, that just makes everybody more vulnerable. So that's, what are they going to be for? And of course, there's great pressure to use them. They were very expensive. They were considered the backbone of the fleet for such a long time. It turns out later in the war that they're great for gunfire, naval gunfire support against the shore. And of course, there's a new generation of fast battleships that emerge in 1943 that can keep up with the carriers. But that said, you're right. I mean, Nimitz finds himself an old submarine hand who had commanded a battleship division, but did not wear the wings of an aviator. And there were a lot of people in the Navy, most of them aviators, who didn't think it was right that either a submarine guy or a battleship guy should be in charge of a Navy where carriers were the principal striking arm. And there was a lot of tension between the aviator community, known as brown shoes, and the surface warfare community, known as black shoes, about who should be in charge. And that's one reason why Nimitz's temperament was so important to his command, because he had to bring all these people together on the same side so that they could all work cooperatively to get the job done.
So Craig, as you just touched on kind of the changing nature of naval warfare and what these new ships were going to be like, what sort of decisions is Nimitz making really early in this war that are going to kind of have far-reaching consequences? I mean, how far ahead is he thinking at this point?
Well, here's a couple of things he knows. Number one, he knows that the overall strategic principle for this war, decided on at levels above his pay grade, is Germany first. The United States and its British allies are going to focus on the defeat of Germany first. It's the most dangerous. It's the one with the highest GDP, gross domestic product. It's already conquered most of Europe and is halfway to Moscow. So it's pretty clear that a lot of the resources on the mobilization are going to go to Europe. That's one problem he's got. Number two, although there was a 1940 Naval Expansion Act, the Vincent Trammell Act, that would more than double the size of the Navy by 1943, those vessels wouldn't become available until midsummer, let's say, of 1943. So his job is to hang on during that first year, maybe even year and a half, not give up anymore if he can avoid it, but he's not expected to go on the offensive. He's to hold what he's got, protect Hawaii, maintain the sea lines of communication with Australia, so that when those new ships become available, he can launch an offensive. On the other hand, his boss, Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations and Comanche, is eager, let's say, for a Pacific offensive. Keep the Japanese back on their heels to make sure the Japanese don't get too comfortable in establishing their defensive perimeter, and to make sure that the army in Europe doesn't gobble up all the resources. So King is pushing him to do something, to be proactive, while at the same time the assets he has available are very limited and the overall strategic plan is to defeat Germany first. And here again, it's one of those places where Nimitz has to balance and judge and manage these conflicting pressures from various sides.
Well, one of the early battles and pivotal battles and great moments in the Pacific is the Battle of Midway, when the U.S. is definitely outgunned by the Japanese, because we've got 2 3/4 carriers, with the Yorktown is sort of barely functioning after the Battle of Coral Sea, and the Japanese have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm not sure how many. But Nimitz does not command the force that fights at the Battle of Midway. That's Admiral Raymond Spruance, who's a fantastically interesting person on his own. But Nimitz is the guy who kind of rolls the dice, makes the decisions, decides to trust in the fragmentary intelligence. Talk about what he did and what his role is in the Battle of Midway.
Yeah, Midway is absolutely the decisive moment in the Pacific War, certainly in 1942, arguably in the whole of the Pacific War, because it changes the trajectory, it changes who has the initiative, who has the momentum. Up until June 4th of 1942, it was the Japanese who decided where the battle would be, what resources would be applied, and we reacted to that. After June 4th, 1942, that's completely reversed. The United States and its allies decide where the next battle will be fought, and the Japanese react to us. So Midway doesn't determine the outcome of the war, but it determines who's making the decisions about the way the war is fought. So in that respect, it's absolutely a critical battle, not only of this war, but arguably of any war. Now, Nimitz's role in this is also critical, because remember what I said just a moment ago, that the Pacific is supposed to be in a holding pattern, a defensive pattern. Well, Nimitz could argue that the Japanese are coming after Midway Island, so that defending that island is part of his portfolio. That's within his decision-making capacity. And he decides to trust the information being provided to him by his intelligence officer,
Leighton.
Senior moment. Yeah, Eddie Leighton, who gets that information from Joe Rochefort down in Hypo, the code-breaking group. And there's skepticism about that in Washington. And yet Nimitz, from the beginning, decides that these guys know what they're talking about. And he makes the command decision, a risky command decision, that he's going to commit all that he has available. The 2 carriers that have just returned from the raid on Tokyo, the Doolittle raid, and the battered and leaking and cranky Yorktown that struggled back to Pearl Harbor from the Coral Sea. He's going to send them all out to sea into an ambush position to jump on the Japanese when they come. Now, you mentioned how many carriers the Japanese have. They had 6 big carriers that they used to attack Pearl Harbor, but 2 of them had been employed in the Coral Sea. And although neither was sunk, one was damaged and the other lost a lot of airplanes, and the Japanese didn't think they needed them and held them back. Not Nimitz. He sent everything he had. He patched up the Yorktown as quickly as possible. He put the airplanes from the Saratoga, which was back in Bremerton, Washington, on the Yorktown so that they would have a full complement of airplanes, and he sent all of it out to a position optimistically named Point Luck, north of where the Japanese were supposed to be coming, to ambush them. Now, this is a very bold decision, and I don't think Nimitz often gets the credit he deserves for being that bold. I'll mention one more thing, and that is that when Halsey's 2 carriers came back from the Doolittle raid, Halsey himself was a wreck. He had skin disease, we now think probably shingles, but we can't be sure, but certainly severe enough that it was clear he could not command. Nimitz ordered him to the hospital, but first asked him who could take his place in command of that task force. And the answer, as you mentioned, was Raymond Spruance. Also not an aviator, no gold wings on his chest. So here's another black shoe, another battleship driver who's going to be in charge of a 2-carrier task force. And he's not even the senior officer in command. The senior officer in the Battle of Midway for the United States was actually Frank Jack Fletcher, another battleship driver who didn't have wings on his chest. So This increases the risk component. I mean, Nimitz could have said, oh, gee, I have no senior aviator admirals. I have a crippled carrier. I'm outnumbered 2-1. I'm not going to do it. He does not do that. He instead takes the bold option and sends those carriers out there. And, well, as we all know, it worked out pretty well.
So, Craig, one of the things, I spend a lot of my time with folks in Europe, and one of the issues that always pops up is people will say, well, Eisenhower was really just kind of carrying out Marshall's directives, and he was, Eisenhower was just sort of the mouthpiece. And I've heard a same sort of thing described for Nimitz and King. I mean, Forrestal says that Nimitz is King's creature. I mean, I'd like you to maybe wrap a couple questions up together and say kind of what was the relationships between Nimitz and King, and is King basically directing Nimitz, or is Nimitz his own man and developing his own strategy?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's good.
Both of those things. That's
Next
very
question.
good. King was a fierce individual. I mean, the old joke is he shaved with a blowtorch. His daughter once said he's the most even-tempered man in the Navy. He's always in a rage. He's a very hard man to work for. He has the highest possible standards. He does not suffer fools. And of course, working for somebody like that is extraordinarily difficult and requires a great deal of finesse, shall we say. What Nimitz was able to do was respond to the most immediate of King's demands, explain to King when necessary that that particular demand is not going to work out, and also on occasion resort to subterfuge to get around some of the demands that he couldn't convince King were unreasonable. I'll tell one story about that illustrates this. When he had Halsey's 2 carriers in the South Pacific and wanted to recall them to Hawaii in the belief that the Japanese were coming after Midway, something King had not quite fully accepted yet. He needed to get those carriers back. King was reluctant to let him do it. So Nimitz sent an eyes-only message to Halsey saying, I want you to move your carriers into a position where they're likely to be seen by the Japanese. And once the Japanese spotted him and reported his presence, he then said, well, I have to recall him because he's been identified. So there's a little bit of subterfuge going on here. So in addition to his agreeable temperament, his willingness to stand up to King if necessary, his willingness to accede to King's demands when he had to, he also would occasionally find ways to get around what King wanted him to do. That allowed him to do what he believed needed to be done in spite of King.
What is the other line about Admiral King, which if we were actually on broadcast, we couldn't say, but we're not, so we can, is he's the guy who supposedly said, when the going gets tough, they send for the sons of bitches, meaning himself, because he'd been put out to pasture himself, but it's like, well, now the war is coming, now we need that guy.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And he used that phrase a lot. There was actually one case where he was standing next to a rear admiral who'd just been promoted. And he turned to him and said, you know why you're never going to make it to the top? He said, no, sir, Admiral, I don't. He says, because you're not a son of a bitch. You have to be a son of a bitch to get to the top. So he acknowledged that in himself, but believed it was a strength, not a weakness.
So Nimitz held command from the moment, not the moment, but shortly after Admiral Kimmel was decapitated after Pearl Harbor till the end of the war. Was there ever a moment where his job was in risk, where he found himself maybe in a controversy or something that might have cost him his job?
He thought so. I'm not sure he was correct in this. He believed that Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who had told him when he got ready to go out to Pearl Harbor that he was the savior of the country and all this business, within a few months thought that Knox had become disappointed in him. In a private letter to his wife, he said, I'll be lucky to last 6 months. This was in response, by the way, to a letter she had written him saying, I had lunch with the wife, Secretary Knox, yesterday. And he wrote back, saying, good, do more of that. That's because I might be in trouble here. So he believed there were moments when Secretary Knox and by extension President Roosevelt were asking themselves, is he the right guy? And there's no doubt that King asked himself that question a lot. Excuse me. King believed that Nimitz that he wasn't a son of a bitch, that he wouldn't discard officers quickly enough who proved that they just couldn't handle it or weren't sufficiently aggressive. He wasn't mean enough, that he would have empathy or sympathy for his subordinates, and war was no place for empathy. You got the job done or you got out. Well, that's not Nimitz, and he did have empathy for his subordinates, and perhaps the most famous case is of Robert Lee Gormley, who commanded the South Pacific, who was, by the way, King's choice for that job. But King became disillusioned very early on and really thought Nimitz ought to let him go. Nimitz kind of helped him out, sent him support, backed him up, gave him a boost, but finally decided, yeah, he's over his head. And not just because he doesn't have the capability, but because he's suffering physically. He had abscessed teeth, something Nimitz knew a lot about, having teeth problems, and was in such pain that Nimitz really feared he would have a nervous breakdown. So he relieved him, replaced him with Halsey, and that's the kind of thing that King thought, well, that should have been done months ago. So his superiors did occasionally have questions about him, but in my personal opinion, I don't think he was ever seriously in jeopardy of being dismissed.
One of the things that there was a statistic that you gave in the book that really struck me, and I wanted to use it as the basis of my next question. You say that when Nimitz takes command in 1941, his staff, or the staff he creates immediately, is 24 men.
Yeah.
By 1943, his staff is 245 men.
Correct.
What does that say about the nature of this war and the demands of this war in the Pacific, that you have that much of an increase so rapidly?
Yeah, I mean, you could actually turn that around and say, let me explain to you what this war did with the pre-war Navy to the wartime Navy. And that probably illuminates it or illustrates it as clearly as anything does. The pre-war Navy could get a staff of 24, was pretty robust, pretty substantial in 1940. By 1942, with the pending Central Pacific Drive on the table and all that's going on and dealing with the Army and the Marine Corps and the Army Air Forces and all this other, and not to mention logistics, which we haven't even mentioned yet, which was enormous in the biggest theater of the war, you needed people who were in charge of all of those things. Nimitz didn't like it. Nimitz was frustrated by the fact that all of these people kept showing up at his headquarters as his new logistics third assistant for oil delivery and the new personnel chief responsible for Marine Corps second lieutenants, and all these people were showing up. He used to be able to sit down at one table with his entire staff and have a conversation. Well, by the end of 1942, and certainly by 1943, that's out the window. Hundreds of individuals were on his staff, some of whom he didn't even know by name. And that frustrated the hell out of him. But it was the nature of the war. And Eisenhower's staff in England was bigger than that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, along the same lines, there is an enormous expansion of the U.S. Navy. I think at one point during the Battle of Guadalcanal, if I remember this correctly from your book, in 1942, the U.S. has one operating carrier. They have other carriers, but they're not able to operate at that point. And 2 years or so later, 26 months or so later, Nimitz can afford to send 17 carriers, 17 aircraft carriers on a raid of Tokyo in early 1945, which isn't even part of the invasions of the islands and all that stuff. So I mean, what struck me is that his job changes remarkably over 2 or 3 years. I mean, as did Eisenhower's, as did Marshall's, but it's a kind of extraordinary.
No, it's absolutely true. And what it underscores for me is the absolute stupidity and blindness of the Japanese warlords who said, oh, well, we can knock the American fleet out for 6 months, solidify our defensive perimeter, and they won't have the wherewithal to come back and take it back. So we'll win this war. Yamamoto tried to tell him, I've been in the United States. I've seen the United States. I've seen the way Henry Ford builds cars. I've seen the oil wells at the Spindletop oil fields in Texas. You can't beat these guys. Well, yes, we can. No, it's true that the most striking aspect of American victory, particularly in the Pacific War, but arguably in World War II at large, is the American ability to produce the instruments of war at unimaginable levels. In fact, in September of 1945, when the war ended, the United States had on the books 99 aircraft carriers. Now, some of those
they're not all full size.
Light carriers, yes, I know they're not all the big deck carriers. They're not all Essex class carriers, but 99 aircraft carriers. Just saying that in 1941, they'd have locked you up.
Yeah. Well, but it's also, if you can forgive me a follow up here, one of the things that was, and maybe you can, and maybe you can't.
Maybe you can't, but it's going to happen.
I understand that, but it's going to happen either way. One of the things that's interesting is that the first part of that, not the 99 characters, but the carriers, but the first half a dozen or so, come from the Two Ocean Navy Act of 1940, which you mentioned briefly, but you talk about a little bit in the book. Yeah. And what was interesting to me is that, you talked about the myth about that everybody didn't think that it was going to just be a battleship war. But there's another myth, which is until December 7th, 1941, we are not preparing in any way for the war. And suddenly we have to go over to a war economy. This is 2 years before, a year and a half before December 7th. We got a double or more the size of the Navy. This is a serious case of looking into the future and going, yeah, this is what the crystal ball says. We got to prepare for war. And who is the person who's doing that? Who is the farseer there?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the
I've heard of him. Yeah.
I mean, and I would ally with him, Carl Vinson, who's head of the Navy
committee in the House.
In the House.
Yeah.
They, I think, appreciated, and the trigger that did it was the fall of France. I mean, up until June of 1940, it was possible to say this war won't touch us. Most Americans believed World War I had been a mistake. We should never have gotten into that. We didn't get anything out of it except for a lot of dead Americans. That was a mistake. We're never going to do that again. But the way it was defended is, with the fall of France, it's now likely that Germany will win the war in Europe and then will come after us. And when they come after us, we have to be prepared to defend the Western Hemisphere. And the way to defend the Western Hemisphere is through the Navy. So making that argument, it was possible to get this two-ocean Navy bill that to authorize the construction of no fewer than 18 aircraft carriers. Remember, you only have 4 or 5 at the time, depending on how you count the Ranger, which is a smaller carrier. So the construction of 18 aircraft carriers, and I've forgotten a dozen battleships and 100 and some odd destroyers. I mean, it's
extraordinary
appropriation. It's an appropriation to create a navy as large as the entire Japanese Navy as it existed at that moment. So it's a huge commitment, and it passed. And this is the thing that knocks me out. It passed 116 to 0.
Jesus.
What could you pass in the House today? It would get a unanimous vote. I can't imagine.
The Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medalist. But anyway,
maybe not, Rick. Well, I think your point is a very good one. That yes, the attack on Pearl Harbor was an astonishing wake-up call, especially for those Americans who were still in the isolationist frame of mind. That brought them around. Up until then, Roosevelt was working. How far can I go before public opinion, which opposes any involvement with Europe whatsoever, bites me in the ass? I mean, Lend-Lease, can I get that? That barely passes a single vote. Yeah. The Conscription Act.
The extension of the draft, one vote, I think.
He's pushing the outside of that envelope as far as public opinion will allow him to go. And the Two-Ocean Navy Act was certainly part of that.
So, Craig, you had mentioned this in one of your answers earlier, and I had this on my list of questions. But one of the things I'd like to get your thoughts on is the question of logistics, because I know when I go out the Pacific, to try to describe to people just the logistical effort to carry out this war is staggering. And one of the things that really struck me when I was reading your book, that came through in the book, was Nimitz really gets the logistical challenge where sometimes other people don't seem to.
Yeah,
So
I
maybe
think
you could
that's
talk
true.
a bit.
I think that's true. There's an old line, you guys have heard it, most of our watchers and listeners have heard it, that when talking about war, amateurs talk about strategy, but professionals talk logistics, because you can't do anything unless you can support and sustain that force you put in the field or in the ocean or wherever that force may be going. Nimitz knew that from the very beginning, and there's no doubt about it. One of the guys he really revered was Admiral Calhoun, who interestingly was the grandson of John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. But he was in charge of the logistics in the Pacific and did a tremendous job. But Nimitz oversaw that, so much so that early on, when his staff was still quite small, we talked about the 24 or so people that he had initially, when his staff was really quite small, he almost got down into the weeds with logistics. He sends a message to Frank Jack Fletcher, who's in the South Pacific prior to the Battle of the Coral Sea, detailing the number of barrels of oil available on each of the ships and of the tankers and oilers he's going to send to sustain them, and how long that will allow them to stay at sea. He had this all worked out. Whether he did this himself on a sketch pad on his desk or he had a logistics officer who supplied him with the information, but he's very much on top of all of that. And I think he's ahead of many of his peers in that respect. The thing to keep in mind about both theaters is that, yes, logistics are critical. You can get across the English Channel on D-Day, but if you can't supply them and feed them and provide them with the oil, the fuel, the tanks, the jeeps, the planes to keep going, that's a complete waste of effort and energy. But the Pacific times 3. The Pacific is enormous. The distances are almost unimaginable. It's almost 4,000 miles to California, another 4,000 miles to Tokyo. The distances are mind-boggling. In fact, here's one that I like to cite. People often look at me quizzically, thinking I'm making this up, but you can look it up, as they say. And that is that if you took all of the land masses on the planet, all of the continents and all of the islands, all the land masses in the continent, they would all fit inside the Pacific Ocean with room to spare. The Pacific is enormous. So sustaining Hawaii is bad enough. You have to bring, there's no oil in Hawaii. It all has to come from California. And so does everything else. And then from Hawaii, it all has to get to Guadalcanal or Tarawa or Kwajalein or Iwo Jima or wherever it has to go from there. And not only do you need the tankers to do it, you need the escorts to support the tanker and so on. It's just an enormous
and you lay this out. You have to prepare the waves of these convoys. They're going to have to come to support you. So you're sailing. It's going to take you 3 weeks to get there. So weeks before the invasion lands, you're sending the convoys that are sending support that are going to come 3 weeks or a month later.
Right.
It's a pipeline.
And at any given moment, there are several of those convoys at sea, because one go, a week later another goes. The first one is still at sea. A week after that, the next one goes. The first two are all still at sea. So it is, pipeline, I think, is an appropriate term. Not literally, of course, but it's a continual flow of material and equipment to the front.
I can go, Chris, or you can go.
It's your turn, right?
It is kind of my turn, but I didn't. I always, I defer to the senior historian. He is the senior historian of Stephen Ambrose.
Yeah, that $5 will get me a cup of coffee.
Yeah, Craig, can I talk to you about your research a little bit, and a particular part of your research that I found quite interesting. You relied heavily on something called the Gray Book. And the Gray Book is basically a collection of Nimitz documents, orders, etc., of about 4,000 pages. But what I think is, the reason I bring it up, and the reason I think it's interesting in a lot of ways, but I'd like you to talk about what it is and how you relied on it. But it's also all online right now, and has been for a while, so that anybody can go in and look at it. I went in and pulled up a not so random page here, making a reference to a battle we haven't talked about yet, and a message from Nimitz to Halsey saying, "Where is Task Force 34?" that some people might remember. But all this stuff is there online. What is the Gray Book? How much did you rely on it?
Oh, thank you. The Gray Book, and why it's gray, I don't know. It's bound in navy blue. I guess the original binding must have been gray. There are 8 volumes, each volume of which has between 800 and 1,000 pages. So saying it's 4,000 is underestimating the size of this thing. Volume 8 in particular focuses on the Battle of Midway, but mostly it's chronological. So you can start out with volume 1 and go all the way through volume 7, and you get what you just showed there. The original copies of the messages, these are naval messages. Sync Pack, in this case, refers, of course, to Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, that's Nimitz. To Com Third Fleet, that's Halsey, Commander of the Third Fleet. Info Cominch, that's King. And Commander Task Force 77, that's Kincaid. So they're getting information copies of this message. And you can see that it's by date. You see the date of the month in the left-hand column, and then the time. But notice at the top of the page, it says GCT, Greenwich time. So, of course, this is not when it's being sent in Hawaii or when it's being received in the area of the Philippines. This is, they're using that 24-hour clock out of Greenwich to cite these. And a lot of historians have looked at these date time signatures and thought, oh, that's when it was sent. No, careful. You have to really work out in some detail when and where the people are who are sending and receiving, what the time is locally when Greenwich Mean Time is whatever it is on that particular message. So there are some pitfalls built in, but boy, is it a great source of original information. Now, a lot of it are these naval messages, maybe half. The other half are something that were called daily summaries that were kept by staff officers at Nimitz's headquarters. Every day, Nimitz held a staff meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning, and based partly on the staff meeting and partly on things that happened, the senior staff officer assigned to this duty would write up everything that happened that day. What we talked about, what we said, what we decided, what we're worried about. So it not only gives you what these naval messages said to each other, from King to Nimitz to Halsey and everybody else, but also what was taking place in the staff while they talked about it. And they're not all sequential, so you have to be jumping back and forth all the time to put the pieces together. But boy, what a blessing to have this material. Now, when I first started using it, I had to use the originals, which are in bound volumes in the Naval History and Heritage Command in the Washington Navy Yard. But since then, they have, as you noted, been put first on a CD. Here it is.
A CD?
Great book. Boy, do I not let this get out of my sight.
What is a CD? What compact disc of some? Where do you play that?
And now, as you point out, actually online and available to everybody who's listening to this.
Yes, and for you watching us live or watching on YouTube, we just put the link up so you can see, you can find it, you can go in and search, and to your heart's delight to get your own experience with the primary source material.
So, Craig, one of the other things that I kind of like to get your take on is, of course, as the war in the Pacific continues and it grows and it expands, as we've talked about, Nimitz finds himself doing things that I'm sure most naval officers really hadn't imagined. He's overseeing massive land operations. I mean, he's overseeing, corps and armies, which is not something you're usually taught about, I would imagine, at Annapolis. Yeah. How would you assess him as a ground commander?
Well, we occasionally talk about armies at Annapolis. Usually comes with the word beat.
I left you that softball.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Keep in mind, Nimitz is SINCPAC Fleet. He's the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, but he's also SINCPOA, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Area. That means he commands everything. The fleet, the Army, the Marines, the airplanes, everything in that theater is under his command. So Army generals within his theater report to him. Marine Corps generals report to him. Obviously, Navy admirals report to him. So he's like Eisenhower in Europe, commanding not just Navy forces, not just American Navy forces, but the naval forces of every Allied service and the Army forces of every Allied service. And yes, that's not something he's had to do before, but it's not something anybody's had to do before. And there's objection to this. We have not mentioned my good friend Douglas MacArthur,
Yeah.
who commands the Southwest Pacific area. He too is commander-in-chief, it's his title, but he's commander-in-chief of only about a third of maybe less than that, about a quarter of the Pacific Ocean area. The area includes Australia, New Guinea, Borneo, and the Philippines, but all the rest, all that water area. I love this photo that you put up, by the way. If I had a caption, the caption would be, "Look, Douglas, here's where Japan is."
That's Douglas MacArthur on the left. I think it's the only photo of Douglas MacArthur in the audience, not speaking, as far as I can tell.
By the way, he hated this photograph because it shows his bald spot. You notice that comb over on the top. He absolutely despised this, wanted to make sure no one ever saw it. Too late. Sorry, Douglas. But why did we start with this question?
Well, basically, about Nimitz as a ground forces commander.
Oh, yeah, as a ground force commander. Well, obviously, the Marines from the beginning had been under his command, and that's something he was relatively used to. The idea of putting Marines ashore in Guadalcanal, for example, they were under his command indirectly through the Southern Pacific Command, Gormley, who we replaced with Halsey. We talked about that. But also the Army. And keep in mind, there were 5 times as many Army soldiers in the Pacific War as there were Marines. Right. Marines have a very good PR program going. You know, we think there are only Marines in the Pacific. And they were often at the tip of the spear and did a lot of the hard work, no question about it. But there were lots of Army forces there, many of them under the command of Douglas MacArthur, but some of them under the command of Chester Nimitz. And so there were also British and Australian and New Zealand soldiers, some of whom were under Nimitz's command as well.
You called Peleliu, the invasion of Peleliu, in, I think it's the fall of 1944, Nimitz's biggest mistake. So can you briefly, and I know it's hard to be brief on that, but can you briefly explain what Peleliu is and why is it a mistake?
Yeah.
What does Nimitz do wrong here?
I can't resist, before I answer that question, of making a comment about the fact that I've always referred to the landing at Tarawa as Tarawa, and I heard somebody else call it Tarawa. And I thought, what? Really? So I looked it up, and Tarawa is actually the correct pronunciation for that linguistic group. But Marines have called it Tarawa for 75 years, so it's Tarawa to me. Similarly, Peleliu is the word the Marines use to describe that island, but I think you're probably right that Peleliu is probably the correct pronunciation. In any case,
I'm not claiming. Yeah, go ahead.
Peleliu or Peleliu was an island in the Palau group, and Nimitz had promised MacArthur that he would neutralize its airfield to protect his right flank as MacArthur moved into the Philippines, and felt he had an obligation to live up to that. He didn't want to give Douglas MacArthur any reason to say the Navy let me down. So when news came that they were going to accelerate the timetable for the invasion of the Philippines and land at Leyte rather than Mindanao, and that Peleliu could be bypassed, Nimitz considered briefly doing that, calling off the invasion. But 2 things. One, the invasion force was already at sea. The UDT SEALs had already been on the beach, clearing it of obstacles. Calling it back at literally the last moment would have been like, I don't know, putting the toothpaste back in the tube. It would have been a very hard thing to do administratively and logistically. And then secondly, he wondered whether MacArthur would complain about that subsequently, that Nimitz had not lived up to his promise to support him. And so he let that operation go ahead, even though he might have recalled it. He knew pretty quickly that that had been a mistake because the airfield on Peleliu held very few Japanese airplanes. It would not have been able to interfere with MacArthur's landing. And the Japanese on Peleliu adopted this was the first of the various circumstances where instead of launching these suicidal bonsai charges, they hunkered down into a series of caves and tunnels and defied the Marines to come and get them. So Peleliu turned out to be a terrible, time-consuming, bloody slog, so much so that the Army had to come in the 81st Division and relieve the Marines, who had suffered so many casualties they were barely battle-worthy at that point. And then the Army, using the much slower, more deliberate approach, probably appropriate to those circumstances, managed to gain control of Peleliu. But it was a tough slog, and clearly not worth the cost that it had taken to both the Marines and to the Army.
So Craig, I think since we're running out of time, we want to ask you these big, weighty questions that you won't have time to get into in great detail. But one of the great debates coming out on the war, and it does touch on our good friend Douglas MacArthur. And if Rick could put up that picture again.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. You have the great debate about the best way to kind of come to grips with Japan and end the war. And there's the Central Pacific Drive versus whatever it is that MacArthur's doing. And I kind of like your take on that controversy and who was right.
Yeah, who was right? Well, we won the war, so I guess it worked out. There are several things afoot here. It's not just whether there is a Central Pacific Drive. It's whether after the conquest of the Marshalls, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, and others, and then the Marianas, from which, of course, homeland Japan could be bombed from the air. The next step after that should be either to the Philippine Islands or to Formosa. And either one would work strategically / logistically. And that is to occupy an important position in between Japan and its critical resource base in the South Pacific. Japan went to war in the first place to get the oil and the rubber and the tin and the iron and all the raw materials of the South Pacific that it needed to sustain its war industry. And the Philippines sat astride that, but so did Formosa. And Ernie King and the Navy, and King in particular, wanted to go to Formosa for two reasons. Number one, it would interfere with that trade, so would the Philippines. But Formosa would also allow the United States to cooperate more effectively with the Chinese on the mainland. And King wanted to use the manpower of the Chinese army to wear down the Kwantung army in mainland China. Right. And the Philippines would not do that. But MacArthur's argument that, look, I said I would return. I meant it, and I'm going to do it. And nobody in Asia would ever trust the United States again if, having said that, we did not do it. And that's the argument that won the day. Now, I think King was right in this respect, that taking the Philippines, there are 1,000 islands in the Philippines. You had to take all of them. That took the rest of the war. When Japan surrendered, that battle was still going on. Right. On the other hand, the occupation of Formosa would have been a lot tougher than King suspected, and the Philippines would be on the left flank of any forces going into Formosa. So there's an argument on each side.
Oh, well answered.
Well, Craig, thank you. Craig Symonds, thank you so much for joining us today. And we know you're on a schedule, but we so appreciate your being here and taking the time to speak with us. And Craig's most recent excellent book, among many excellent books, is Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. It's interesting from page 1 all the way to the end of the book. And it does have that drink recipe on page 149.
So that's another reason to buy the book.
Although I did just post it also for those watching. It's on the link there. But Craig, thank you so much for joining us. And only 2 more visits to our show and you get a free hat. So,
hey, all right.
Just keep that in mind, okay?
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Chris. That's always a lot of fun.
Good. Glad you're here. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Always great to talk to Craig Symonds. And I did recover from the effects of that drink, although it's difficult to see how we won in the Pacific if people were downing a lot of sink pack specials.
Well, I was going to see if I could order one here in Tokyo. I thought that might be Tokyo, but I don't know.
I noticed the last words of the title of Craig Symonds' book are, to Tokyo Bay, and there you are. You're there at Tokyo Bay. So how appropriate.
I am. I got to Tokyo Bay just to look upon it and say,
There you go. Next week, we're going to talk to Holger Afflerbach, who's the author of On a Knife Edge, How Germany Lost the First World War. And Chris, you just attended a lecture by him, didn't you?
Yeah, it was not too long ago, and he has some really surprising, enlightening, and I think kind of scary things to say about the course of World War One and how it may have gone, and some Germany decisions Germany made or didn't make that will really you'll get a new look on the war.
And how it might
It's
have
very
gone
good talk.
differently, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So really looking forward to that show coming up next week. Thanks everybody to join for joining us.
Where will we be next week, Rick?
Where will we be?
Where will the studios be?
I'm going to be in Chicago next
Oh, okay.
week, and I
Oh,
think you might be in London.
am I still in that? Okay, good. All right.
And
And then we
when
go somewhere.
we sign off, we'll be next week. We'll be able to say that we're going to have dinner the following night in Normandy.
Hey,
So
'cause I'm due for some Calvados.
I think that's right. Or maybe I've got a week off. I'm not sure. But in any case,
Scheduling department off.
yeah, it's a little, when we're dealing with all these future dates, it gets a little confusing. I just go where the airfare tells me to go.
There you go. Sound policy.
Listen, guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Be safe.
Always a lot of fun.
Good. Glad you're. Thank you.